Hello everyone and welcome to our Maths Evidence Briefing. My name is Karen Robinson and I'm the Deputy Director of Lincolnshire Research School and also a primary teacher. I'm very fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Drake, who is our secondary maths specialist and also works with the Maths Hub. So it's great to have his experience here today, and he'll be talking us through the Key Stage 2 and 3 guidance report. So just as an introduction, a little bit about what we do in our role as a research school. One of the first things is we generate information. We take part in trials. We try and really understand that evidence, what is working well in schools and what isn't. With all of that information, we then make a synthesis, which is the toolkit that you'll be very familiar with, both the early years toolkit and the teaching and learning toolkit. And that tells you about the impact, the cost of that, and the amount of evidence about that. Our role today particularly is that mobilisation. It's getting that evidence into the schools to try and make the greatest impact that we can. To tell you a little bit about the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation is an independent charity, and it's dedicated to breaking the link between family income and that educational achievement. And like I just said, we're trying to support the schools, the nurseries and colleges to improve that teaching and learning by really understanding the evidence and what works well. Just thinking about what's happening at the moment and the attainment gap in England, as you can see, there is already a gap starting with our early years at 4.6 months. But that really scary thing is that doubles, that by the end of Key Stage it's doubled, and by the end of Key Stage 4 it's nearly doubled again. So that importance of really trying to make a difference to what's happening in our classrooms and trying to change that disadvantage gap is why we're here today, because as we know, this is all about employment outcomes later life. So think about why we use evidence. Well, it helps teachers and leaders to make those more informed decisions about what to do more of, and also what to stop doing. It gives us our best bets. It's not always the answer to everything, but it's the best bet for what we have. And if we're not using evidence, then what is it we're using? So we've got our evidence, but most importantly here is your professional expertise and that understanding of your context, because the evidence will look different in different places. When we put those together, we get our evidence-informed practice. Just if you have got this not via a link but someone shared it, if you could just fill in this QR code, it just helps us find out which schools are engaging with us. So thank you for doing that. So to give an idea of what's happening at the moment, Maths in a Minute, there's a lot out there. So this is just an overview of all the places you can look for further reading of what's happening. Of course, we've got our MPQ, our national qualifications. We've got all our guidance reports, which we're going to be talking about today, what's been happening in maths hubs and Ofsted, as well as the other things here. Today, our main focus is going to be on the Improving Mathematics in early years in Key Stage 1 and Improving Mathematics in Key Stage 2 and 3. But the golden thread running throughout all of these is that metacognition and self-regulated guidance report, which we'll be sharing with you today. So what we're trying to do today is just look at the headlines of this. There is so much there that for you to then dig deeper into later. This could be a discussion point. This could help you in staff meetings. It could be a starting point to see where you are at the moment. Also, to signpost you, there is a lot happening. The theme at the moment for our research school network is maths. And if you Google into that website, you will see pages of amazing blogs on many of the things that we're talking about today, which will enable you to dig deeper and also exemplify how it looks in our classrooms. Also to point out, there's the clips from the classroom. And as you can see in the maths, we've got 7 clips, really useful for you to see this happening in primary and secondary and how it actually looks. So we're going to start with our Improving Mathematics in early years in Key Stage 1, and those headlines here, which we'll be touching on some of them, will be really to make sure we develop that practitioner's understanding of how children learn mathematics, making sure that there's that time that's dedicated for children to learn mathematics into their everyday life. A key running through both of these guidance reports, of course, about use of manipulatives. There's a lot about that at the moment. And just ensuring that that teaching builds on what they already know and that high quality use of interventions to support our children. So just having a little look at that first recommendation, developing practitioners' understanding of how children learn mathematics. You know, research has shown that complexity of mathematical development, and we know that a secure grasp really does take a long time. And if a child has appeared to have grasped it in one context, they may not have grasped it in another. So it's making sure there's that time to look at it in different contexts, to revisit. What is really useful about this one is the developmental progressions. So the research has suggested there's possible paths that children follow, which are these progressions. Of course, we know that children all learn at different ways and at different rates, but these are showing the best examples of those operational development. And this spiral progression highlights those individual skills and how concepts develop over time. But we also know that these will overlap, and it's very important to understand that that development is not linear. So what the key things when you're working on professional development with your teachers is understand that mathematics themselves, but taking time to really look at this mathematical development and those developmental progressions, and maybe exploring a little bit more about those misconceptions as well, and understanding that effective mathematical pedagogy. So how do they learn mathematics? It's really important to know those children well, and just to take time understanding where they're at, that use of assessment, or if we're in our early years, just observations, discussions, and really understanding a culture, creating this culture from the very, very beginning that supports those children's curiosity, thinking and problem solving, and just making maths a really very positive experience, and making sure they're engaged in that appropriate cognitive challenging activities. So if we look over here, the mathematical development does not only rely on specific mathematical knowledge, but there's lots of other skills. For example, and we're going to talk about this a lot more later, those executive functions, the working memory, and children all have different working memories. And so it's knowing how long they're remembering, when we're needing to revisit, linking to that self-regulation and metacognition. Language skills, we're going to talk about more later, but really checking they have the vocabulary, explicitly teaching the vocabulary, so those children have the effective communication and mathematical thinking, so they can talk about that and grasp those concepts. Certainly in early years and Key Stage 1, those motor skills are really important because they're going to be manipulating those materials. They'll be moving around, counting objects and blocks. They'll be developing their handwriting to be able to form those numbers. And if those children are struggling with those motor skills, then that could be a barrier to their learning because they're not able to record those numbers or move those manipulatives around. So just accessing those children's prior experiences and knowing where they're at those mathematical activities. And this is really important, that their interest and enjoyment, and thinking about their attitude towards mathematics, because if that starts in a negative way, this will follow them all the way through. So just some key things to think about and discuss with your staff. How does that look in your school? What sort of things are you doing to follow all of these, and do you know where your children are at this moment? Just an interesting example about developing self-regulation. Like I said, we're going to talk about it more, but starting to think about how we're giving those the ability for the children to reflect on their own thinking process. How are they learning to monitor what they're doing? How are you asking those questions to develop those thinking skills, and giving the children the language to discuss what they're doing? So we're thinking about that planning, monitoring and evaluating of their learning. So just going back, just things to think about now is how you're going to use this information, making sure that you can support your practitioners to make sure they've got that good knowledge of what the children need to learn to progress, making judgments about the range of experience that the children benefit from, to have that full understanding of that mathematical topic, going back to the diagrams here, thinking about what the children need to know before they develop that particular skill, how you're accessing that understanding, and also where you're going to intervene at that right moment to make sure you're challenging and supporting. And this is a really good point just for you to stop and reflect with your staff at this moment. So thinking about recommendation 2 is just making sure that there's time dedicated for children to learn mathematics and be part of their everyday life and what they're doing. How are you linking it to other subjects? How are you linking it to storybooks, puzzles, songs, rhymes? Seize every chance you can, like we said, to reinforce that mathematical vocabulary, creating those opportunities for discussions. And this just highlights what I've been saying, really. Really make sure that planning is there to think about which books you've got, which puzzles, which songs, are they integrated or not? What are your routines to highlight that? And making sure that play is really purposeful. When you have a game, what is the purpose of the game? Is it repeating a practice? Is it extending a skill? Is it supporting learning through practical ideas? Is it helping them find out what they know? So this is a really useful way just to think about your planning. And again, with another example here, really thinking about the purpose of the game you're doing and that maths in your learning that you're setting up. So now we move to manipulatives and representations, and you will see that it runs through both of them. It's recommendation 3 in the early years and Key Stage 1 guidance, and it's recommendation 2 in the Improving Maths in Key Stages 2 and 3. So lots to think about here. And maybe some useful questions that you could start with is, where are you now as a school? What manipulatives do you have and how are they being used? Do you know what's happening in your classrooms? And what are the key messages that you would like to be given to your teachers or leaders in this about how we're using this? You know, what is that understanding? So this is a year 1-2 example. Have you mapped out how you're using? Is a good understanding of how those concrete examples manipulatives can be really used, moving to that pictorial with that link there before the abstract. And if children are ready to go to the abstract, can they still understand and discuss the concrete and the pictorial model to really reinforce and get that mastery of understanding? And again, the concrete, the pictorial, abstract, none of this is linear. It will move back and forth. So that's a good thing to think about, and have those conversations about representatives. What are they? What examples are you using in your school? You know, what are their purposes? And in the guidance report, when you have a look, there's some really useful examples of how to use them. You'll find lots out there, and I've added some at the end of this PowerPoint. You know, those tens frames, the use of numicon, understanding those number bonds to 10 and how they bridge over, but they're linking it to that pictorial as well. Finally, this is a useful way of just mapping that out. How can you use 10 frames? How does it look in year 1 to year 6, the number lines, and all of these? So just have a look at class, see what you're doing. And a very useful thing, if you wanted to have a look and reflect with your teachers, is how confident do they feel in using these. So before we move on to Doug and looking really into that improving maths in Key Stage 2 and 3, is there anything you wanted to add about manipulatives?
Hi, thanks, Karen, and hello, everyone. Yeah, as I'm talking with secondary schools, I think there's been a real buy-in for the use of manipulatives. People have seen the real benefit that there can be there, and that language of manipulatives and representations is really used throughout secondary schools far more. I think that challenge that we've still got is how we have the consistency of implementation, particularly across a large cohort. I've worked with schools where they may have 50+ feeder primaries. So how do you ensure that they're able to benefit from the use of those manipulatives? Is it that you've got to give that time when they come to you to go through them and teach students how to use them? Or is it the fact that you can be a bit more proactive and work with some of your primaries to try and encourage that happening? And certainly through the Maths Hub and some of the work groups that we see taking place, that's a great opportunity for people to do that. And those people have really grasped the use of it and are making the most of it. I think that's the final hurdle for them in making it as effective as they possibly can. But hopefully that just gives you a few thoughts there on how, if your secondary teacher sat looking at that, benchmarking where you're at and some of the things that you might need to consider if you want to make it as effective as possible. As Karen said, I'm going to talk through a little bit in terms of the secondary guidance report and some of the bits that are there. There's lots that have been talked about, the idea of manipulatives and some of the other areas. So I'm going to focus in on kind of 3 key things that I feel that schools are having quite a few conversations about. And on this next slide, you'll see that they're there in terms of problem solving, which quite a few people are talking about, the idea of modelling thinking, and also the idea of promoting discussion. Now, the wealth of ideas and models within this particular presentation, so I'm not going to go in depth with all of them, but they're all there for you to have a look at. The idea being that whether you're an individual teacher sat here want to improve your practice, or whether you're a leader who's thinking about how you could work with your department or your team, you might want to utilise some of these models to kind of get that level of consistency and common thought about what we're trying to do. Hopefully there'll be things that you recognise, hopefully there'll be a couple of things that might be new to you that really resonate and you think would be quite useful. So as we go through the next couple of slides, we're going to have a focus on problem solving. And the first thing whenever we come to these ideas is to think about what people believe and what they think about these things. So the next slide suggests that you might spend a little bit of time with your team talking about what do they think? What do they think problem solving means? What does that mean to them? What are their experience of it? If your maths teacher is as old as me, you will have experienced coursework and taught coursework. That's massively different to those teachers who are coming through and training now. So our experiences are going to have a real impact on what we think that looks like and how we can integrate it into our classrooms. There's a definition on the next slide that we might see in terms of what problem solving is. And then over the next couple of slides, we're actually seeing Polyer's problem solving techniques. Well, this was a model that was introduced a long time ago and certainly was there when I was training and talking about how we might problem solve, what we might be able to do. And Polyer talked about some of the different problem solving strategies that we might actually use. So here's the overall model. And on the next slide, we've got some of those strategies that were talked about in terms of what problem solvers would be able to do. And as we're talking about this, particularly from a secondary perspective, I'd really encourage you to think about that next steps, which is a common message for us. What do employers want? What are those employability skills? And actually a lot of what we're seeing here are those things that employers are saying they really want. So as well as building on what's happening from the primary phase, we also need to be looking ahead, not just to Key Stage 5, but also to apprenticeships and college, and equipping students with some of these skills, which are what employers continually come back to has been really positive and in terms of what we need. So then we've got under on the next slide, we've got a little bit of a recommendation here, how we can improve problem solving. So this is something that you might want to look at individually. It's something you might want to look at in terms of your team and use as the basis for some of your professional development or some of the conversations that you might have. And there's strategies that are recommended, such as on the next slide, where we've got the idea of one problem, multiple solutions. And I'd really encourage you as teams and individuals to have a consistent language so you understand what you're talking about to each other when you're trying to implement some of these different approaches. And at the very least, hopefully you can take one of the slides like this and try it out with some groups and see how does that work? How does that feel? What kind of skills are my students using? What kind of knowledge is that developing? And so that's kind of a little bit of a summary around what conversations you might be having in terms of problem solving, how you might be able to use some of these ideas that are here just to frame your thinking and support others in having better conversations about it. Next, we want to have a think about modelling thinking, or how do we model what's going on? And this is a big part of conversations I'm seeing at the moment, those conversations about how teachers share with students what they're thinking, which in turn enables students to talk about their thinking. And obviously there's a huge part of this that links in terms of our metacognition. So I'm just going to hand back to Karen, who's going to talk a little bit more just about the focus around metacognition and how that can be really beneficial.
So as mentioned before, the metacognition and self-regulation guiding points is the golden thread that's going through all of this. And it's thinking about how we're going to develop their own thinking and getting pupils to examine their existing knowledge to inform their selection of a particular approach to mathematical tasks, but also monitoring what they're doing and thinking about how they're going to change that approach or continue that based on the evidence. There's many explicit strategies for that, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Think aloud, how we're going to ask those questions, but really purposeful questions as they work through the task. Worked examples, so much about how we do them, worked examples, failed examples, and that idea of encouraging self-explanation, encouraging pupils to explain to an adult. So developing, as we talked about, almost in that key stage 1, the language, the vocabulary, to be able to communicate their ideas. But just to give you an overview from there, you're probably very familiar with this because it's in the Metacognition Guidance Report. And it's that idea of students being able to plan what they're doing, to monitor where they are and to evaluate, but also in knowing that they need to have knowledge of themselves and how they work, but also of the task and different strategies that they've been taught to be able to solve them. So they know where they're going to go. Are they going to be, is it going to be concrete, pictorial, abstract? And there's lots of useful, into this one. This is a good overview of all of that. I think it shows you that planning, the monitoring, evaluation, that idea of understanding knowledge of task, strategies and of self. And at the side, you can see some really useful questions for each of you to support your students when you're teaching them to be metacognitive. And this is the slide I was going to refer to. Some really useful questions of, have I seen this task before? What's the prior knowledge? You know, am I sticking to my plan? If it's not working, what do I need to do that? How have I evaluated it? And that knowledge of self sometimes is even just having the resilience to keep trying, the perseverance, rather than just going straight to a teacher, rather than just giving up. All of that understanding about how we think and how we work. This is just a really useful model, I find, to think through that, just high quality teaching, to think through your staff, how you are activating prior knowledge, what are you using, what's the retrieval, how are you finding out those misconceptions as well. What is the explicit instruction look like? How are you modelling? Where's the memorisation place? Is it fully taking place? How do you start to move away towards independence, that guided practice with those scaffolds in place, moving to independent for that structured reflection? When I send out this, I will share our metacognition and self-regulation booklet that we made, but we just tried to split that down. A lot of talk about the worked example, the modelling, the fading. We're going to talk about think alouds as well, the use of scaffold. And as I said there on the Research School Network, there's many examples of this and clips from the classroom, but also in terms of blogs. I'm just going to pass back to Doug now.
Thanks very much, Karen. And as I talk through these next couple of points, the ones around modelling thinking and promoting discussion, obviously there's a lot of crossover between the two of them. But that first one around modelling thinking is really trying to get you to be very explicit about what it is that you're doing. Because if we understand what we're doing, then we can improve it and we can change it. And so as we flick forward through the slides, we've got some things that hopefully will be quite familiar to you that you'll have seen previously. There's some ones here that have got a couple of videos that can help think aloud. People in the past have called these walking, talking mocks and modellings. Again, different phrases that we might have had through them, all of which can be beneficial and helpful to pupils. A little bit more guidance to things that if you prefer to watch a video. I'm thinking particularly if you're a department and you're wanting to work on this, then using a couple of these videos as a stimulus can be really helpful to start those discussions off. And going through from that, people will have talked quite a lot about using worked examples. What do those worked examples look like? Here's some examples of ones that you might possibly use. And again, that element of language that might help you to explain exactly what your thinking is going to be about. Carrying on through what we've got in terms of the slides in the deck for you to have a look at. Some questions that you might choose to ask yourself or ask yourselves as a department to consider how you can work as effectively as you possibly could. And then I believe coming up next, we've also got another bit of guidance around that we can use to help structure that reflection in terms of linking it back to the ideas of the problem solving. So again, if we've done the problem solving, but we also want to have that kind of mathematical thinking and modelling, how are you modelling your ideas around that? And it's really important when we're talking about that modelling of thinking. What were you thinking before you started the question? What were you thinking as you worked through the question? And also, what were you thinking after the question? In the past, we've kind of talked about that, check your work. Students at secondary are really hesitant to do that and to understand what it means. But actually, what do you do after you finish the question? How do you double check that the units are there, that you haven't made a silly mistake? And that obviously ties in with what Karen talked earlier about understanding the misconceptions that you might make and how we can check up on those. So thinking about how you're going to model your thinking at those specific different times and trying to encourage students to be able to utilise that effectively as well. So here we've got some possible debrief or those questions that you might do afterwards. We've also got some other research that's coming through in terms of that you might be able to use to refer to. That's helping you a little bit thinking about the problems that you might want to use. Because again, if you're going to model your thinking, the problem that you use needs to give you opportunity to do that. So it is that phrase of carefully crafted questions is equally as important when you're setting pupils' work as it is when you're trying to model something. And a lot of thought needs to go into the examples that you're going to use so you can exemplify the thinking that you want from them. And there's a whole load of other ideas that we could have gone into here about that kind of I do, we do, you do, to kind of phase that into that, and in terms of very similar questions so that they're getting the opportunity to think in a similar way. So this isn't anything different to probably what you've been doing already and those strategies that you've been using. It's hopefully just giving you a different way of incorporating those together and really focusing in about how can those strategies I'm already using support me to model how I want pupils to think. As we know, a lot of mathematicians will be able to come up with it for themselves, but a lot of students need that scaffold and support to be able to do it effectively. So a couple of videos there, maybe some questions that you might be able to use in terms of thinking, modelling the thinking, and also that idea of verbally and written. How are you writing it down? How do you want them to write it down? How do those steps in that working really exemplify the thinking of the steps that we want to go through? Is it they're almost creating mini stories and sentences in terms of what needs to take place in their working? The last bit that I want to talk about ties in with that, which is promoting discussion. I think this one becomes even more relevant because whilst it might not have been at the forefront of mathematics department's initiative, it's certainly at the forefront of whole school department initiatives. And there's a lot of secondary schools out there who've had an emphasis on oracy and how can we develop the speech that's taking place in our classrooms. And sometimes secondary maths teachers have found it a little bit difficult to say, well, how do I incorporate that into my classroom? What would that actually look like in terms of mathematics? So over these next few slides, hopefully we've got a few examples here of how that might be able to support you in terms of being able to do that. So if we're just moving on through the slides. So why is high quality talk important? Whenever you're trying to convince yourself to do more, because we do enough already, but if you're trying to do a new initiative, it's good to understand the rationale of why it's going to be beneficial. And if you are someone who's sat here as a leader wanting to work with teams, it's important to share that rationale of what's needed. So this document here provides some benefit in terms of what can be helpful in terms of doing this that might be used to persuade people of why they want to get involved and why it's going to be useful, particularly in your context and specific to that. Just continuing through. So we've got some more evidence around why high quality talk is available to you. So if you are someone who likes to engage with the research, wants to read through that and get the ideas from it, here's something else that you might want to have a little bit of a look at to find a little bit more information about. Obviously, within early years, there's the recommendations about how we do that. And on the next slide, we've got it for Key Stage 2 as well, where there's recommendations there in developing independence and motivation, which are going to tie in with students wanting to communicate. If they don't have the motivation to, they're not going to. All of you will be able to think of learners in your classroom who are incredibly shy, incredibly wary, and how do we create that culture where people are motivated to want to share their ideas? So those two bits around independence, confidence, motivation really goes hand in hand in terms of kind of getting people to want to discuss and promote what they're thinking. Moving on from this one, who's going to benefit? Well, actually, we all benefit from it, as we know that, particularly as teachers, in trying to find out what it is that pupils understand and what they can do. I did work with a colleague years ago who said the questions that people ask and the answers that they give are all I need to understand how good a mathematician they are. And it took me a while to understand what he meant, but he was absolutely right. We can understand so much about what's going on in their head that we might not see in their working. So really encouraging those conversations, getting that benefit of pupils working together. More schools in secondary are going towards mixed ability in year 7, seeing that actually those conversations between a more able and a less able mathematician, how beneficial they are in the more able mathematician explaining their ideas and in the weaker mathematician getting the benefit of hearing those. So it ties in with how we might even structure our lessons and our setting as we go through in terms of secondary. But it's important that we as teachers, when we're designing that, we're aware of what the benefits are likely to be. So we're designing it to get those benefits out. But as Karen mentioned earlier about that playful practice in terms of students, I'm always a fan of that in terms of teachers as well, that we're willing to try stuff and we want to innovate and we want to try those things out. So hopefully from some of these slides here, you'll be wanting to go away and try some of these things in your classroom to see how they work out. As we go through, we've got a model that's going to come up that's going to be a little bit helpful, hopefully, in terms of that. So we've got a few more bits there. So here, the toll model is something that's come out from the EEF. I think the next slide just blows it up a little bit more for us, Karen, so that we can see it a little bit more clearly. So these are some of the features that we would get in high quality teacher-pupil talk. So how do we get them to take part? How do we get those levels of participation? Certainly a lot of the schools that I've been to have used mini whiteboards as part of this to try and get people to put their answers down and then maybe talk about it and share what's taking place. The opportunities that are there for mistakes and explanations, again, Karen's already referred to misconceptions and using those to kind of to inform and support our teaching, and having those open questions that means that teachers or pupils feel that their contribution is worthwhile. If you've been around, again, I'll go back to as long as I have, Dan Mayer produced some really nice videos a while ago and talked about the notion of a level playing field of intuition. That actually, could you ask questions where everybody could offer an example, everybody could offer an answer? And I think that was a really nice way of thinking about how do I encourage people to communicate and want to share and have this discussion and talk that's going on. What are the prompts for it? So how can you encourage people to talk me through it? Why did you do that? Be that at whole class level, small group level, or even individual level, all beneficial. And then that idea of comparing different approaches, which comes back to some of the stuff that we'll have seen around the problem solving from that and how it can work with it. So as I've said at the start of this, it might be that some of these models are particularly helpful in terms of you talking about it and framing it, and hopefully the told model will be something there that you can utilise and think about when communicating with other members of staff. Just moving on from that then, I think we're coming on to just a summary in terms of one of the models. I think we've got a video here that can be used to support in terms of what you might want. Here we've got them in a bit more exemplification than I've just talked through. So hopefully if you want more detail, you've got them here. And each of the next few slides just does that in terms of talk, kind of giving you some scaffolds or other things that you might be able to use to support what we're going and what we're talking about. And there should be a video that's coming up that's on specifically the key principles for teaching that will enable you to have a little bit of a look around that. So if you want to watch it in a little bit more detail, as I said, if you want to watch it as a team, then that would be there for you to be able to utilise and work with a little bit more. The last bit that I want to do is just looking at one model that maybe brings all of these things together and particularly focusing on point 5 around those elements of independence. So what we've got here is a kind of collective one, just going forward from that one. So this one here that we're talking about, motivation, own thinking, discussion, explanation and learning. The reason I wanted to pick this one out is that I really like that first point around motivation. Adults modelling motivation, confidence and enjoyment in maths. I think that's one of the things we talked about a lot in secondary, that idea of being champions of maths. Can everyone be a proponent of it and want to develop it? But what does that actually look like? And then particularly if you're sat here as a leader, it'd be quite interesting to say which of your staff promote motivation. Which of them would their students say, I want to join in because my teacher's so excited and engaged with it. So I think it's a real nice one as we end on and think about what we've done today. We're in this to enjoy it. We want to make these changes to be better and enjoy it more. We want to enjoy our teaching. We want students to enjoy what they're learning. So where does that motivation come from? And so having this one that really thinks about how we start from that with ourselves, how we encourage that to be taking place. And then actually that leads nicely through into those other things we talked about. How do then we model that thinking in a motivated way? Why are we excited to find the solution to what we're looking for? And then how does that encourage a bit more discussion that's taking place? How have we exhibited that we wanted to talk about our mathematics and explain what was going on? And so students want to talk about their mathematics and explain what's going on. And hopefully in that, then we've got that idea of learning a little bit more and how we can benefit particularly from those tasks that we're trying to do. So I think we've just got a little bit more in terms of exemplification around those that you might want to have a little bit of a look at. And then I think we're back into that key bit that sits behind all of what we're talking about, which is just having that high quality teaching and how we can ensure that that actually takes place. And so I'm going to bounce back to Karen just to kind of finish off mentioning those.
Thank you, Doug. And really everything we've talked about today has been about that high quality teaching, thinking about how we use metacognition, thinking about accessible prior learning, thinking about misconceptions, motivation, explicit teaching. So the key is that, but it's just the time to reflect on each of those steps, what we're doing well, what you might want to do a little bit more work on, what do you want to find out a little bit more about. And as we said, there's a lot in here, and we skip slides to give you the chance to go back and look at them in more detail. And a lot about what we've done today is just try and signpost you to useful videos, materials and EF resources, which we will share with you when we send this out. So just to conclude, as ever, the key to anything working well is implementation. So once you've found all of this out, it has to be thought through, that whole implementation process. And as you know, there's the new implementation guidance report, which will support you in doing that really well. Once you've done that explore phase, which this can help you do, you'll start to prepare that implementation plan. So then you can go into delivery and really thinking through that. Hand in hand with that implementation guidance report, of course, is the professional development guidance report. So you can really think about how you're going to map out your professional development, how you're going to revisit it, how you're going to sustain it, and think about each of these mechanisms to make sure you've got that full picture, to make sure that you've got the best chance of your professional development succeeding. It's been a whistle-stop tour, but that leaves me just to say thank you very much for your engagement. Time really to reflect on any learning you've got, but after this, what might your key reflections be? What are your next steps that you're going to take away and explore further? We've already, this is our fourth evidence briefing, so you can still sign up for other ones you haven't. We have our send coming out and are working with parents to improving behaviour. If you sign up, you'll automatically get them. If you haven't, then now is chance to do that. And that just leaves me to say thank you for engaging with us and for signing up for our evidence briefing, and to thank Doug very much for his expertise in this matter and for his time. And we look forward to seeing you on another evidence briefing.